Welcome to the World Bank Praxis discussion series. I'm Oscar Sabakti. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, those watching on APAC, online and listening on radio, and everyone watching in Honiara, Dili and Port Moresby. The world is facing a worsening youth employment crisis. Young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults, and almost 73 million youth worldwide are looking for work. It's one of the few major challenges that affect both developed and developing countries, from nations in Africa to countries in Western Europe. The International Labour Organization reports that more than 1 in 10 young people around the world are looking for work, and the World Bank's 2013 World Development Report has found that 620 million youth are economically idle, that is, not in education, employment or looking for work. In our region, the Pacific, a staggering 70 to 80% of young people are considered idle. But what are the causes of this problem, and what role can the public and private sectors play to help solve it? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined by Stephen Close, Human Development Specialist at the World Bank, Public Policy Consultant Richard Curtin, and Dr. Jioji Ravulo, Lecturer in Social Work and Community Welfare Studies at the University of Western Sydney. Thank you all for joining us. Firstly, I've painted a pretty grim picture of the problem. Is it accurate? Is it really the global challenge that I've just outlined, Stephen?
Well, I think if you have a conversation with someone in government, a policymaker from almost any country around the world, they will be very concerned about the job situation in their country and in their region. But the jobs agendas in different parts of the world are of course different. I think the urgency of this issue internationally has been highlighted with incidences such as the Arab uprising, and the World Bank's World Development Report 2013 has highlighted these issues in its focus on jobs. I think the World Bank is particularly interested in seeing jobs as a driver of poverty reduction and growth in itself. From the education perspective myself, I see that the jobs crisis around the world is also a skills crisis. It's a crisis in the sense that while 72% of educators believe that the education and training provided to their students leads to employment, only 42% of employers see it that way. It's basically a mismatch between the training that's provided and that's actually in demand from employers.
Jioji, you're based in Sydney now at the University of Western Sydney, but you've also worked in Pacific Island countries looking at this problem. Can you just paint us a picture of the problem in the Pacific Island nations that you have worked in?
I think there's a variety of different youth issues that do exist across the different island states in the Pacific. And one of that is being able to aspire towards vocational and educational outcomes. This might be because of a variety of different cultural perspectives and factors that may deter the ability for young people to feel like they can aspire to further education and training opportunities. And I think this in itself then deters the ability for our young people to have the capacity to secure or be job ready. There are other concerns I think that do also occur off the back of that, and that includes being able to access other social and welfare resources to counteract other needs that may occur, including mental health and other areas of recreational support.
Stephen, you've looked at several communities in Asia and the Pacific. Can you tell us what the costs are of this problem to societies?
Well, I think it's good to look at the demographics in Pacific Island countries. And there is a particular issue that in countries such as Solomon Islands, 69% of the population are under the age of 29. There's a youth bulge in many of these countries. And in some Pacific Island countries, there's a release of that demographic pressure through labour migration. For instance, in Tonga and Samoa, there are high rates of labour migration. And in those countries, up to 30 or 40% of GDP is contributed by remittances from people working overseas. But countries like Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea don't have that kind of release. And local opportunities in formal employment for young people are very limited. There are risks and opportunities in having a large youth bulge in the population. The opportunities for countries with economic growth is that a larger labour force can contribute tax dollars to improve services and improve future growth. Of course, the risks are that if this large population isn't provided with opportunities, it can lead to social unrest, as we've seen in several Pacific Island countries, and that includes in Timor-Leste in recent years. And so this becomes a very important issue for governments and policymakers to try and work out how employment and training opportunities can be expanded for young people. And that's the kind of dialogue that we'd really like to contribute to.
Let's look at Timor-Leste for a moment. Richard, you've worked extensively in the country looking at different issues, but Timor-Leste is a country that has a so-called youth bulge, a big youth population. What have you found there? Is there a large youth unemployment population there, and what are the effects of that in that country?
Well, first of all, I'd like to define the youth bulge as the proportion of the youth population in the adult population. What that does is highlight the pressure that young people are placing on the arrangements, the employment arrangements, etc., for that adult population. And typically in Timor-Leste, it's 1/3 of the adult population are aged 15 to 24. So I think the big question, of course, facing young people is they're often more highly educated than earlier generations, but they're coming onto the labour market at a time when a very large number of their peers are also coming onto the labour market. So it creates a high level of competition, but also many of the jobs are already taken, for example, in the civil service. So that, I think, is the major issue facing Timor-Leste now and in the future. Each cohort, each 5-year age group is going to be larger than the previous one, and they're going to come onto the labour market with high expectations coming through because of increasing numbers completing secondary school there, and the jobs are not going to be available.
So Timor-Leste is unique in the sense that it has great resources on hand that can be tapped into and are being tapped into at the moment. So with that wealth coming in, why is it that there's still this problem of youth unemployment and disengagement in the country?
Yeah, that's a very important issue that the government is coming to terms with. What they've emphasised, I think, is trying to spend the money as quickly as possible because the economy was so flat after the crisis with the formation of the new state. And a lot of money's been thrown out there, but to get that money spent quickly, you have to import foreign skilled labour. And in particular, some 12,000 have come from Indonesia to work on building projects, etc. So it was the trade-off. To get reconstruction done quickly, you needed skilled workers, but at the same time, it meant the arrangements to give young people the chance for apprenticeship type opportunities, learning on the job, etc., were a lot more difficult to arrange because they take longer.
So is this part of the problem that the young people in Pacific Island communities and parts of Asia, they're just not being upskilled, they're not being trained? Is that a major part of the problem?
I think a major characteristic of the issue is that Pacific Island countries prioritise investments in skills, and that's without doubt that most countries in the Pacific spend more than 1/5 of their government budget on skills training. But the question is, what is the quality and what is the allocative choices in those investments when there's a large proportion of those skills budgets which are going to tertiary scholarships, often for public servants, and very little of that investment is going to second chance education and training opportunities to benefit the large proportion of the population that has dropped out of school or left school with inadequate basic or technical skills that would enable them to proceed to further employment and training. So some of these choices come back to governments in how they shape skills policy to support that transition from school into employment.
Jioji, is that the case in your experience? Are you finding that the governments are placing too much of an emphasis on, say, formal training with scholarships that Stephen says are only benefiting a few, and less so on the informal sector? Is that what you're finding?
I think it's important to start to acknowledge some of the cultural perspectives when it comes to formal education and training. From a Pacific point of view, formal education is still an important part of your development and your experience in life. But what brings power? So from a Western frame of thinking, knowledge is power, and you obtain that through formal settings of education. But from a Pacific perspective, family is power. And so you learn a lot of what you need to know in life through your kinship, through your families, through your communities. And I think sometimes the emphasis on being able to aspire to further education and training, which then promotes lifelong learning, may be deterred. And this is not me saying that there's issues with the Pacific culture or how we take or how we emphasise those particular areas. But from a Western way of thinking, again, we overemphasise the need for formal training and education as a means of being able to succeed in life. So I think there needs to be a balance found between those cultural perspectives and those Western perspectives when it comes to appropriate training and education.
Stephen, if we could look at a bit of your research, you've found that there's a mismatch or a disconnect between what businesses need in terms of skills and what governments are actually training or offering in terms of training and education. Can you just tell us a bit more about that disconnect?
Yeah. I think when you look at employer surveys from around the world, some of the results, especially from an educator's perspective, are quite startling. That what employers are asking for is consistently quite different from what education and training policymakers prioritise. Employers are consistently asking for behavioural skills, personality traits such as work attitude, commitment to work, the ability to problem solve, much more than they're looking for certain levels of educational qualifications or technical skills. This, of course, depends on the country and the region, but this is very much true in Pacific Island countries, where often employers are saying, we're happy to train people on the job, but people need to be willing to turn up to work consistently and have the right attitude to work in order to hire them. Having communication skills is also prioritised by employers. So although employers don't often specifically say that literacy is a gap that they find when they're recruiting candidates, our research on functional literacy shows that people with functional literacy have a much higher likelihood of having worked for a wage than people who've completed various levels of schooling, for instance. And one of the reasons for that is that there are a lot of Pacific Islanders who are completing primary and even secondary education without becoming functionally literate. So this skills crisis does come back to the need for basic education to provide basic skills.
So by functioning literacy, do you mean the work ethic and that 9-to-5 mentality, or that idea of working in that environment?
Functional literacy is just the ability to read and write as adapted to the needs of everyday life. And that really basic skill and expectation which people have of the education system is not happening in too many Pacific Island countries, despite this large investment.
You could mention how it was tested in those surveys in Vanuatu, Solomons and Papua New Guinea in a very simple way.
Yeah. Well, I think there's often a single word question in censuses, which is, can you read and write? And people often say yes. So that is why many Pacific Island countries have an 89% or something close to that level of literacy. But when it's actually assessed in a statistically representative survey with a question such as a picture of a bird, a fish and an eye, and a link to these words in English or Pidgin, it was found that the people who could actually recognise these words and letters was much lower than the self-reported rate of literacy. So in Solomon Islands, different provinces have rates of functional literacy ranging from 7% in Malaita to 33% in Renbel and Isabel, and it's similar in Vanuatu, I think in the high 20s. And even in primary school completers, only 28% of primary school completers have that basic functional literacy.
Jioji, is that what you've found as well? Are we jumping the gun in terms of wanting to train people in advanced skills, yet many of them don't have the basic skills that are needed? Has that been your experience?
I think there is a question in regards to what are the basic skills used for. It's still coming back to whether, when we are formally training or going through an education system, what is the point and purpose? A lot of young people have an understanding that if they do finish secondary or the middle years of schooling, what does that then mean? Does it mean that they will go into further education and training, or will they need to seek some form of employment if available in the low-skilled labour force, which means then that they don't necessarily have to aspire to increasing their levels of numeracy and literacy, because by default they're just going to end up in a low-skill job. So there are, I think, concerns either or in regards to trying to put into a bigger context the desire to definitely upskill and have a benchmark for Pacific young people to aspire to, but what is the point and purpose of that aspiration when it comes to the reality and also to the future goals that they're striving to possibly achieve?
I definitely agree that it's important for evidence and for policymakers to consider the reality of where young people are headed in terms of employment and self-employment. The reality for most young people is that they won't get formal jobs, especially in countries like Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. So the question is, how can those young people make a transition from subsistence agriculture or inactivity to higher levels of economic activity? That might be self-employment, micro-enterprise, various kinds of livelihoods, and education systems need to recognise some of the community level skills which are needed for those outcomes, rather than focus only on the academic skills that are going to benefit a small elite that may become tertiary scholars or public servants.
It sounds like part of the problem here is the idea of urbanisation, people moving from the village into the cities, and the issue of migration, people moving out of countries altogether to countries like New Zealand and Australia. But Richard, in terms of having realistic aspirations, what role does government have in that?
Look, I think the opportunity for young people to acquire the skills to enable them to gain skills entry to New Zealand and Australia is very important, because the jobs are very limited in these small countries, if you're continuing to educate people in middle level skills and tertiary level skills, you've got to give people the opportunity to use those skills, otherwise you're leading to a lot of frustration. I think there is a need for governments to enter into bilateral arrangements where there are clear mechanisms where young people, for example, the Australian Pacific Technical College, according to an Australian audit report, says that very few have migrated to Australia, even though it was originally set up as a means of giving people qualifications that they thought would be recognised in Australia. So nobody's really followed it through. They've set it up and they're spending a lot of money on it, and people are getting skills through it, but one of the objectives of it hasn't delivered. And I think there is a need for perhaps a regional employment strategy, and there need to be within that bilateral agreements between Australia and New Zealand in relation to each of the countries as to how people who acquire the skills can then get the work experience and then can make the transition into short-term skilled work in Australia, for example.
You've mentioned short-term, but is there a fear that perhaps once these people from the island communities or from Asia work in Australia or New Zealand, that they won't want to go back, and that might lead to an exodus or a brain drain from these communities?
Look, I think there's an overstating of the issue of the brain drain. I think the onus is on governments to be able to ensure that they've got an appropriate supply of skills with a certain turnover that's going to take place, and that turnover is going to come from people retiring as it is from people who are going to migrate. Look, some people obviously will want to stay on Australia, but a lot of it will be to do with the incentives that the host governments provide for people to come back with those skills. And often governments don't even see that as something they should be doing. So if people think if I'm getting well paid here, but there's no opportunity for me back at home, why would I want to go back and beat on doors and get a cold shoulder?
Off the back of that, though, is this ongoing obligation that I think as Pacific people we have towards remittances. I mean, the economies back in the islands have greatly benefited from migration to places like New Zealand and Australia. And I think the issue also remains that a lot of people may be attracted to come across here, or there's been even a large increase in people coming via New Zealand or from New Zealand, from Pacific communities, migrating to the east coast of Australia, and our population is growing and we're more prevalent. But it's a matter of also acknowledging that we're deciding to stay in Australia rather than even go back to New Zealand or the islands, because by virtue we are earning relatively more money in the roles that we're able to get here. And then ultimately in our heads, we're like, well, that benefits the family back home, so I don't necessarily have to return home in person. I'm actually supporting the family because I'm sending monies back. And I know that's a trend that we've seen constantly and commonly across the Pacific, but I think that also is part of the rhetoric that happens today.
So is that a good or a bad thing? Because for people who aren't familiar, I guess New Zealand accepts, gives residency to many Pacific Island nations. So, and because of the arrangement that Australia has with New Zealand, those islanders who go to New Zealand are able to then come to Australia on that reciprocal agreement. But you're saying that they don't need to go back because they're giving money back to their home countries anyway. Is this a good or a bad thing?
So some of the issues that we're having now from a diasporic point of view is a lot of our Pacific young people are still striving, even in Australia and New Zealand, to reconnect to some of their cultural perspectives in the islands. Now we know that, you know, culture evolves in countries of origin, and so a lot of the time we're referencing culture that is not necessarily old school, but can be perceived as outdated compared to what's happening back home. And I think this is creating some of the conflicts that may occur with some of our Pacific young people residing. A lot of my research also includes the overrepresentation of Pacific young people in the legal system, and a lot of it is to do with a lack of connection with culture, but more so also a desire to support the family and not necessarily have aspirations towards further education and training. So there are roll-on effects to a lot of those different concepts and issues and needs. So I think, yeah, it is a big catch-22 where as Pacific people we are always trying to connect by visiting our country of origin, but more so, again, sending monies back as a means of reconnecting and feeling like we are still contributing to our families back home.
Well, I must say, in Tonga, since the global financial crisis, the level of remittances have gone down considerably. And it's a major problem in terms of international cash flow for them.
Yes.
Okay, so we've identified a myriad of problems. What are the solutions? How can we begin to address these problems?
Can we keep talking about the problems?
Let's have some good news.
They're easier.
I think in the Pacific there's a range of measures and existing good practices that policymakers can consider. We talked about natural resources before. So some of the twin priorities there are to ensure the equitable distribution of the revenues from natural resources, and that those revenues are turned into long-term high-quality service delivery benefiting the majority of the population, but also to ensure that there are local skills and employment strategies so that those natural resource operations can employ more local people over the short or long term. I think it's important for policymakers to recognise the realities, including the trend of urbanisation, that young people are going to want to move to urban areas, and when they move, they should bring skills with them rather than turn up in urban centres without skills and without prospects of employment. And also it's important to recognise the reality of the small number of formal jobs, and that most young people will need to enter self-employment or micro-enterprise, but that in fact subsistence agriculture is reaching its limits in countries like Solomon Islands, and that alternatives to subsistence agriculture, alternatives to staying in the provinces, are necessary for a large part of the population. Of course, recognising reality also means recognising the importance of international labour mobility, as we just discussed. But then, of course, on top of that, there's a raft of reforms in skills training systems, including ensuring investments in and support for lifelong learning, including in community livelihoods, so that the benefits of the major investment by Pacific Island countries in skills systems aren't limited to a few tertiary scholarships holders, but are spread more equitably to ensure that the majority of young people have pathways, whether it's pathways into wage employment, pathways into self-employment, or volunteering in community organisations, or further training.
Jioji, how about you? You've emphasised the cultural aspect as being important. You're saying, what's the point in having a career or a job if it leads to the breakdown of culture and traditional ways? Is there a way to marry the two? Is there a solution to all that?
I think there needs to be an integration. I mean, the reality is that the Pacific is now part of a global, economy, global world and population. So it's important to understand that, Western systems are integrated into our traditional ways of thinking. And I think that's a big part. It's about being able to have both Pacific communities, but the systems become more aware of those intercultural variables or some of those characteristics or differences that exist in those perceptions. So being aware of how Pacific communities view their interactions with education and employment providers, and how we then work collaboratively in creating solutions. I think the other factor is being able to promote current capacity that does exist in Pacific communities, and various skills that we do have in regards to being able to work with a desire to support family. I mean, that's a strength. The desire and having a work ethic is also a strength. And I think being able to work with that particular capacity is something that we should be capitalising on as well.
And Richard, solutions. How can we fix the problem?
Well, fixing it's a little bit more difficult. Where to start? I would suggest that young people themselves look to finding available sources of information that they can use to support their case to do something. One obvious example in talking about this mismatch that Stephen's highlighted between what training providers are doing and what job opportunities are available is to put pressure on training providers to do a tracer survey of graduates, so that people who are choosing courses can ask, what happened to the graduates last year? How many got jobs, and are those jobs matched to the skills that the training provided? That sort of information, I've been involved in producing a monograph, a census monograph on young people in Vanuatu, and just completed one for Timor-Leste. Using census data is a very valuable way of being able to present a complex picture of what's happening to different subgroups of young people, so that when young people go to policymakers through a National Youth Council or other mechanisms, they can help get a broader picture presented by providing information, not just anecdotal, but more systematic information about what the current situation is facing young people.
I agree. I think a key element of the skills mismatch is a failure of information. And so there needs to be evidence at a strategic level where policymakers in government talk to each other, but especially talk to employers, and also information at a local level, so that local training providers and especially local students and young people know what the realistic employment prospects are after a certain level of training and where those training opportunities are.
Okay, let's open to questions now. We've got a few coming in from overseas, which is good. Keep them coming. But I'll start with a question from Honiara. This one's directed to Jioji. In Solomon Islands, as in other Pacific countries, cultural perspectives prevent people from aspiring for an education and jobs because they depend on the Wontok system and family as a safety net to fall back on. Do you see this as a problem? And if so, how do you break that habit?
Great question. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, as I said before, it's definitely about being able to promote an integration between those cultural perspectives and also the Western perspectives and looking at the value. So I think at the end of the day, it's about the value that we place on those things. I think there is always going to be an importance placed on how we connect as a family and a community and how that then impacts on our future dreams and aspirations. But I think if we are also empowering young people to understand the value of formal education and skills and how that can contribute to their well-being and their future, that can also impact on traditions and culture. There's a motto that we have. I'm working a lot in this space at the moment in being able to develop vocational and career aspirations in Pacific communities, both here in Australia and New Zealand and across the Pacific region. And the motto that we have at the moment is, when one achieves, we all succeed. And it's this whole idea that if one of us gets a training qualification or if one of us gets a degree, by virtue, we all succeed because we all benefit as a result of that particular achievement. So I think it's also working with families, not just the young people in valuing tradition, culture and the Western perspectives, but helping parents to understand the value associated with their participation in further education and training.
Thanks, Jioji. Do we have a question from Sydney at all?
Talofa, my name is Kate Marioka. I'm a consultant, but formerly a co-founder of Pacifica Youth, which was an online Pacific network set up in 2003 to help young people engage in Millennium Development Goal projects in the Pacific region. We had the pleasure of producing a report for the World Bank in 2008 called Giving Pacific Youth a Voice, which looked at young people's participation in national development. And one of the things that we found really resonates with what Stephen mentioned, the mismatch between education and also what skills are actually required in the labour market. What I'd like to know is one of the key findings from that research is that young people, as well as the evidence of culture of silence, there's a lot of perception about young people being an abundant source of unpaid labour. And I just wanted to know your comments about how young people's contribution to the economy through unpaid labour is being recognised or not recognised by the Pacific Island governments.
I think that is a tricky question. Ourselves, in doing research on the issue of youth employment in Pacific Island countries, we're faced with a great challenge of how do you define youth employment, youth unemployment and inactivity. I think Richard's a bit more of an expert on this than I am, but I mean, in the OECD skills strategy for OECD countries, there is a priority noted for governments to harness skills and encourage people to contribute their skills to the labour market. And that's an issue that's often neglected, that there are unused skills in the community that are wasted when people are not recognised with paid employment. On the other hand, where there are very limited formal jobs in the economy, unpaid volunteer positions are a very valuable source of training and experience, especially where government training budgets are limited. So volunteer work, community volunteer work can be a force of social cohesion as well as employment experience for young people. There is a challenge of recognising that unpaid labour in statistics. There's also, of course, the clear gender dimension, that women's expectations of employment are much less in many Pacific Island countries. Vocational training for women leads much less successfully to employment, and women are expected more to stay at home. So encouraging women's labour force participation by providing training opportunities and overcoming barriers to women's participation is a very big issue for youth employment in the Pacific.
Just to follow on a statistic on that, a survey I've just finished analysing for the Samoan Qualifications Authority of post-secondary graduates, average age 23, 56% were in employment, about 4% were actively looking for work. I think about another 4% had given up, but 14% were doing unpaid work. So I think, and that's where I disagree with the introduction about the proportion of young people being idle. The definition of not in education, employment or work actually refers to paid work. But basically people have got to justify their existence. So they've got to do some sort of activity to get fed by their families or to be seen to be trying to acquire relevant skills through unpaid volunteer work with agencies like Red Cross, etc. So I think it is a very important pathway that people try and use, and in some ways it'd be good for it to get for people to get formal recognition for their work experience.
Thanks for that question. We have a question from Timor-Leste. This one's directed to you, Stephen. What steps have been taken by the government to address the issue of the youth bulge, or what steps should be taken?
Well, I guess in the question of Timor-Leste in particular, there are examples of good practice. Timor-Leste has one of the most developed national qualifications frameworks in the region, which is quite significant given the pace of change in the last 10 years. There are major education and training challenges in Timor-Leste in continuing to build an education system that was in a very poor state at independence after the civil conflict of 1999. But there's good practice. There's employment services centres under the Secretary of State for Professional Training, which helps to alleviate that information failure between young people seeking work and employment opportunities that are available. But of course the demographic context of Timor is a very big challenge, that there's a very large number of young people seeking employment in a very limited number of formal sector positions. So I think Richard has also done some work on a regional employment strategy in Timor-Leste. I mean, part of the solution has to be improved agricultural productivity and ways for young people to access natural resource exploitation activities. And there are challenges with that in the oil and gas industry in Timor-Leste, but entrepreneurship and pathways into non-formal training provided by non-government sources are essential. I think it's really important for the government of Timor-Leste to recognise that it doesn't carry the entire burden for training, that there should be recognition of employers and non-formal providers that can provide pathways for young people.
But one significant initiative that I'm familiar with is that the government has agreed that all government tenders put in a requirement that enterprises are to provide training places for young people. Over a certain amount, but it's to cover all government contracts. And I think this is a key element that governments elsewhere need to realise, that often opportunities for on-the-job training have to be created by government. They have to specify it as a requirement of contracts, and I think donors also have to play their part in this as well. You can't just sit back and assume that these opportunities are going to be there, because people will take what they see as the most cost-effective option, which is to bring in foreign labour, unless there's a specific government requirement that says we want you to ensure that if you do bring foreign skilled labour in, that they're transferring skills to our young people who have appropriate front-end training so they can go into workplaces and come out with internationally recognised skills.
I think it's very important for donors to take responsibility for hiring local private sector companies, and where the capacity doesn't yet exist in the private sector, donors should also be supporting that private sector capacity to engage with donor programs, which are significant forces in the countries we work in.
Thanks, Stephen. Do we have a question from Sydney? Yes, sir.
What I'd like to know is, To what extent is microfinance providing an opportunity for the development of small businesses in the Pacific, especially by young women?
I don't profess to be an expert on microfinance, so I welcome any contributions from colleagues in the room, but I would say that the evidence base is still too limited on the impacts of microenterprise and training for microenterprise, in particular in Pacific Island countries. There needs to be more financial literacy and entrepreneurship training that enable people to start their own businesses, and similarly microenterprise initiatives to provide opportunities for young people and especially women to start businesses, given that these are the main economic opportunities for a large part of the population in countries like Solomon Islands. But of course, international experience on microenterprise is that it needs to be done right. There's a lot of lessons learnt, a good practice on the right incentives for microenterprise initiatives.
I'm working with a couple of agencies, community agencies in the Pacific at the moment, and one in particular attaches microfinance to issues that clients might be experiencing. For example, someone that might be experiencing gender-based violence, for them to develop autonomy and self-efficacy, agencies will put them into contact with microfinance opportunities so that they can become more self-reliant rather than having to go back into the cycle of gender-based violence.
There's a very good example of a ground-up microfinance initiative called Morris Russick in rural Timor-Leste, that if people want to know more about how to do it successfully, could follow up on that.
Thank you for the question. We now have a question from Timor-Leste, this time from someone from the ILO. It's open to the panel. Have you done any analysis on the different access to employment for young women and men?
We've recently done some analysis in Solomon Islands on the barriers that women face in employment, and similarly to the high rates of gender-based violence in Solomon Islands, there are significant barriers to education, employment and training opportunities for women. And there is a particular gendered focus on vocational training in Pacific Island countries, that there are expectations that certain subjects are for women, certain subjects are for men, and also expectations that if women become pregnant, that's the end of their education and training opportunities. And this is a particular challenge when the majority of high school providers in some countries, such as Solomon Islands, are faith-based organisations. There can be conflicts between government education policy and church views on women's access to education in those circumstances. So really there are particular barriers to women in microenterprise as well, that I mean it's related to social expectations as well as the security context for women to go about business. This is a particular issue in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands.
But interestingly, in Samoa, in this survey, it was the women that tended to get the higher post-secondary qualification and therefore more likely to be in employment than the males. So where women see education as a significant opportunity for them and pursue it, then it often results in a better employment outcome.
And this is even if they have children. So they'll still aspire to obtain further education and training, even with the family that they're rearing. Yeah.
This is in Samoa. Okay. But I guess it's different in different countries, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a really different context between Melanesian countries and Polynesian countries, and in Polynesia there is a certain crisis of young men in less favourable education outcomes.
Thank you for that question. Do we have a question from Sydney? So,
I've probably an interesting question to follow off the back of those last comments. To everybody from the board, I just want to get some idea of some of the things that you look at when you measure things like health and success, and I'd also like to know how much autonomy people are given in these communities to judge that for themselves and to learn how to judge that for themselves.
An important part of this survey was to ask people to rate the training that they'd received. We gave them a whole series of statements and they could rate it on a 1 to 5 basis. And then we asked people in an open-ended way, what aspects of the training did you, what skills did you acquire, what skills didn't you acquire, and then what areas for improvement could you suggest? And we were surprised by the huge response we got to the open-ended questions. In fact, we got more critical responses about issues to do with the way teachers were turning out, absenteeism, etc., that didn't come through earlier in the questionnaire. There was a tendency to give a more favourable response, but when we got to the open-ended questions, people were more critical. So I think there is a huge opportunity. I found this with the youth survey in Timor-Leste. Even amongst people who were illiterate, were very keen to be able to offer their own assessment of their own position and the way in which conflict was being resolved in their communities, etc. So more effort at collecting information directly from people, young people themselves, will be a very important part of giving them a voice.
I think it's important to take that broad perspective because we know that jobs are important for economic health as well as personal well-being and the well-being of families. And we know that literacy, functional literacy, is also very important for livelihoods, wealth, employment. The health, for instance, of mothers when they're rearing children is much better when they're functionally literate and able to access health promotion information. And as we've seen, women in Solomon Islands feel much more empowered and able to master their destiny and contribute to their communities when they have functional literacy. But I think the nature of the evidence base on these broader perspectives is often quite qualitative, and we're still struggling to make the case with ministries of finance about the economic value alone of jobs and non-formal education and literacy. So it's important to take that broader perspective, but the evidence base can be difficult to amass.
I think the individual's desire to be autonomous or to control their social and health outcomes is still premised on the family perspective. The individual identity is very much still part of the family's identity. And there are some cultural variations to even understanding health outcomes. So I mentioned mental health before. From a Western point of view, mental health is seen as a medical issue. You go access support and you know, primary, secondary health. There's a trend in a lot of the Pacific communities where mental health is perceived as a spiritual issue. So you're hearing the voices in your head because you did something wrong, or your neighbour did something wrong, or your extended family member did something wrong. So now you have to deal with it through the spiritual way. So being able to be, you know, your own master of those particular outcomes is still very much grounded in the family communal perspective.
Thank you for the question. We've now got a question from Papua New Guinea. This is open to the panel. Prior to independence, PNG had a lot of skilled workers such as plumbers, electricians, and not many qualified university graduates. Now PNG has more uni graduates and less trades people. With LNG, PNG is importing skilled labour from other countries. What steps can PNG take to meet this demand locally?
Well, there's one initiative I'm aware of, and that is that the company, I think the Sustainable Development Foundation, is setting up a training facility in the Highlands that's going to train up to 500 skilled tradespeople. So I think there is an awareness that with particularly the resource boom going on, that a lot more needs to be done to ensure that Papua New Guineans share in the jobs that come out of that, and not just at a basic level, that they need to acquire skills, and funds are going to be directed to that. But I think it's obviously going to be an ongoing issue to make sure that those opportunities are maximised as much as possible.
My feeling for Papua New Guinea is that a high-level agreement between industry and especially natural resource investors and government on a skills strategy to meet these opportunities is needed. There are a number of major education challenges in Papua New Guinea. There are opportunities as well in terms of the increased primary enrolment, increased transition to secondary, but there are also institutional challenges in coordination between some of the sophisticated administrative architecture for vocational training policy in Papua New Guinea. But I think the government really needs the input of the international private sector, for instance, public-private partnerships, to address this skills gap through initiatives, as Richard has suggested.
Okay, we're fast running out of time, but there's some great questions here, so let's try and keep the answers brief. We've got another question from PNG. Youth employment is a major challenge in our country, and this becomes a concern with rural to urban drift when youth can't find work. Are there any programs to address this issue?
Isn't there a World Bank
program? Yeah, there's the World Bank Urban Youth Employment Project, which provides some pre-employment training and on-the-job training for unemployed youth in Port Moresby. Similarly, there's a rapid employment project in Honiara in the Solomon Islands, which has quite a large scope. Something like 1 in 5 people in Honiara are expected to be trained in the pre-employment training of the Rapid Employment Project. But there are actually, in good news, there's a number of good practice examples from around the Pacific on comprehensive programs which provide job training, pre-employment training and foundation studies as a basis for further learning, as well as remedial literacy and life skills training for young people. There's the ABC program in Marshall Islands that Richard has done some work in, and some of the message is that young people need these comprehensive pathways that consider a range of challenges they face in gaining employment or training opportunities, rather than just, say, one-shot vocational training.
Thank you, Stephen. We've probably got time for a couple more. Yeah. Is there another question in Sydney?
Thank you. I'm Grace Arach from University of New South Wales. My question goes to Jioji. You talk so much about culture being very important to the youths in order to help them maybe get in employment. How do you link the issue of culture and employment of the youths, and how do you feel what kind of potential can the youths get within their culture with the advancing technology that needs them to have a more outside skills than their own within their own culture? Thank you.
Great question. I think one of the key challenges is for young people to still esteem and place value on traditional culture. I think there are a lot of influences, TV shows that are beamed in to a lot of island states now that help young people to feel like they should aspire to what America or Australia is hoping, or what that looks like. And I think sometimes that can deter some of those traditional perspectives, like again, the emphasis on looking after your parents or siblings. So I think it's a matter of balancing those different perspectives to still see the importance of and we're not just talking about the traditions when it comes to singing and dancing and performing. We're talking about the everyday practices of what we value in everyday life and how that underpins, our living experience. So I think it's still a matter of upholding those practices, but to balance it still with a desire to see the importance on developing skills and new knowledge bases and perspectives that increase opportunities, including employment. So it's very much a balancing act.
If I could just add to that, I'll pick up on the question about changing technologies. I think globally, part of the jobs challenge is how governments respond to the context of jobs in a world of changing technologies. The ability to adapt technologies to solve problems is now regarded as part of basic skills by employers. There are opportunities for the Pacific. Several Pacific Island countries are significantly expanding their broadband internet access. And as we've already seen with the mobile revolution in several Pacific Island countries and deregulation of telecommunications, it can be a great force for growth. Mobile phones can increase the pace of small business growth, can spread connectivity across fragmented countries, and serve as an instrument of sharing information. I think the Pacific Island countries having English as a common language is a great advantage for industries such as call centres and expanding micro workers, such as the example of Jamaica, where young unemployed people have benefited from outsourced IT work through micro working.
Thank you, Stephen. And we've got two quick questions. One first, Stephen, to you. We've got one question from Honiara. Are youth with disabilities included in the stats for underemployment? Yes or no?
I think youth with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to exclusion from education and training and transition to employment. And it's something that civil society has mostly led the way with. There are examples of some good practice in some Pacific Island countries, like the Able Disabled Centre in Nauru, but that's focused on care for school-age disabled kids. I think disabled people are often overrepresented in the groups of particularly vulnerable and poor and unemployed people in society. There are capacities in civil society that can provide advice and experience on how best to engage those people in a limited capacity context such as Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Stephen. And Richard, you get the last question for the program. This one's from Timor-Leste. In Timor-Leste, employment in general is low, as well as youth unemployment and a lack of education opportunities for youth and training. How do you address this if it's an overarching problem?
Well, I think it goes back to that earlier point that I made. It is very important to expand the opportunities for young people to get employment in skilled areas in Australia and New Zealand. And that, if you're putting a substantial amount of investment in giving people more educational opportunities, you've got to give them the opportunities to exercise those skills. And I think Australia receives something like 120,000 skilled workers on short-term visa arrangements, and the number of Pacific Islanders and people from Timor-Leste in Australia is probably less than 40,000. So it's, I mean, they're not part of the short-term visa arrangements, but the Pacific Islands and Timor-Leste are grossly underrepresented in terms of the opportunities that people from overseas are able to have in getting work in Australia.
Thanks, Richard. And that brings us to the end of our discussion. Can we please thank our panellists, Dr. Jioji Ravulo, Stephen Close and Richard Curtin. I'd also like to thank everyone joining us either here in Sydney or from afar. And remember, you can view this or any other of our Praxis discussions at worldbank.org/Praxis. Until next time, I'm Oscar Sabakti. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.